Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is a brief recap of my lecture on Kantian Absolutism. In my last lecture in this lecture series, I engaged in kind of a more complex structure. I gave you kind of a three-part lecture that started off with an applied ethical issue from the 20th century that allowed us to juxtapose an absolutist perspective with another modern perspective called a consequentialistic, or more specifically, a utilitarian perspective. And then I went back into, in the second part of the lecture, the Kantian attempt to justify ethical absolutism, or the idea that there are some absolute moral duties that have no exceptions, and that we can know that with a kind of an absolute certainty, that there is an absolute truth to be had with regard to morality. And then I finished up in the third part with a kind of a review of the criticisms of Kant. And let me go ahead and briefly review each part of the lecture. So I started off by exploring the dropping of the atomic bombs at the end of World War II by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And without going back into too much detail there, I tried to suggest that this was a gray area in war that seemed to violate, some of the common laws of war or moral rules of war, like the principle of discrimination. And so, when in 1956, the English tried to honor former President Truman with an honorary degree at Oxford University, a young professor by the name of Elizabeth Anscombe wrote a pamphlet and launched a protest against that decision, because she thought that Truman, by dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bombs of such magnitude, right, that you couldn't really justify them as bombs being dropped on a factory or a plant or a military base. They were city-destroying bombs. So Elizabeth Anscombe, with some very tough rhetoric, said, this guy's a murderer and he's a war criminal, and I won't support the honor that the university is trying to bestow upon him. And so what that set up for us, right, was a chance to see two different perspectives on a moral dilemma. On the one hand, based in her personal faith, Elizabeth Anscombe, had an absolutist perspective on ethics that was, we could recall the quote that I used following James Rachel's on this lecture from Letter to the Romans by St. Paul, where he says, you cannot do evil that good may come. And, Anscombe echoes this in her protests against the honor being offered to Truman, in saying, look, you can't murder innocent people in order to achieve your ends, even when your ends are great. Of course, Truman, we know, seems to have kind of weighed the potential foreseeable consequences of the actions. The invasion maybe would have cost 800,000 lives or 1 million lives, and the dropping of two bombs, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, but maybe a quarter of the lives lost that might have been lost in the invasion. And so for that reason, and also non-moral considerations related to Truman's role as a commander-in-chief of the United States at that moment, led him to think the decision was obvious and go against advisors like General Eisenhower at the time and his own Secretary of Defense to order that the bombs be dropped. And again, hindsight's 2020. We know how this turned out, but I thought that maybe revisiting this would give us the opportunity to wrestle with the idea of absolute moral rules versus the possibility of certainly problematic or troublesome exceptions to those duties to, in this case, avoid knowingly taking innocent lives. Anyway, that was a kind of a precursor to then getting back to the attempt from the 18th century on the part of Immanuel Kant in his work, The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, to justify a belief that there are some knowable or knowably true absolute moral duties. And he justified this in a kind of a non-traditional, very modern way, a very post-modern crisis in ethics way, by not appealing to some moral facts, by not appealing to the perspective of some transcendent creator of existence, but instead by appealing to the human capacity to reason its way beyond its feelings, or what he called its personal inclinations, and generate a kind of an objective perspective on life that would allow us to think our way, if we do it carefully enough, to some of our absolutely true, absolute moral duties. And namely, he utilized this thought experiment that I want to get back on the table just for the sake of review, that has come to be known as the universal law formulation of the categorical imperative, that you should act only on those maxims which you could rationally will at the same time that they become universal laws. And that universal law formulation of this command, this sort of supreme principle of morality, is thought to embody the kind of objective perspective on morality that Kant was aiming at, and it generates a kind of a useful thought process where we identify our maxim and we universalize it in a thought experiment in our mind. We imagine everybody acts on that principle or maxim, and then we look for contradictions. And in this way, Kant tried to turn moral dilemmas into kind of logical problems. And we could use our rationality to generate a kind of a logical or objective perspective. And if we ever found contradictions in a world where we had universalized a particular maxim, we would know we would have a duty to avoid committing the action that was captured in that maxim. And then in the third part of the lecture, after sort of going back and reviewing Kant's attempt to justify moral absolutism, we looked at criticisms of Kant's position, some of those that arrived on the wake of his publications in the late 18th century, what has come to be known as the counterexample of the case of the inquiring murderer. Was apparently contemporary while Kant was still alive. That was being discussed. In fact, Kant wrote a response to this idea. So let me get this back out on the table. The case of the inquiring murderer basically suggested that there were at least some scenarios in which telling the truth to somebody seemed like the absolutely wrong thing to do. If somebody showed up at your door and asked where your friend Marcus was because they wanted to kill him, the last thing you want to do, the critics of Kant would say, would be to tell the truth. And you could try to avoid telling the truth or telling a lie, but there's ways that could be forced, namely if the person threatens to kill you or somebody you love, then you got to say something. And it just seems like the right thing to do here is to sort of see the conflict between competing moral duties, being honest on the one hand, and trying to keep somebody from being killed on the other hand. And you ought to realize that in this case, you have a good reason to violate your duty to be honest in order to try to keep somebody alive. But Kant, again, wrote a response to that called On a Supposed Right to Lie from Altruistic Motives, where he basically argued that we are uncertain about the consequences of our actions, whether we, in this case, lie or tell the truth, and we can't ground our understanding of what we should do in morality based on uncertainty. Of course, that would never allow us to arrive at the kind of truth that we're seeking and kind of clarity that we're seeking. Via the process of the categorical imperative and the thought process that Kant has laid out in his great work, The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, and other places like his Critique of Practical Reason, Kant would say, that via this thought process that you have objective justification for knowing that honesty is your duty. You can't violate that based on the uncertainty of consequences. And, if your lie gets, Marcus killed, you've even contributed to the death of Marcus. Okay, so in the 20th century, the utilitarian philosopher who's written a lot on these matters and a lot of very famous and widely used textbooks on this matter, James Rachel, says, look, in response to Kant's article and his counter-argument to the counter-example, Rachel says, look, are we uncertain about the consequences of telling the truth or lying? Yes, of course, we're uncertain about all the consequences of an action that we may or may not take in this moment. However, welcome to life. Life involves a certain amount of uncertainty, and we have to live with that. And if we try to make moral theories which deny the uncertainty of life, then the problem's going to be in our moral theory. And that's in some sense what, Rachel's is saying back to Kant. He's saying, look, yes, we'll be uncertain about the consequences of our actions, but we can be oftentimes pretty well, we can have probability with regard to what we expect to happen. And if you tell a raving lunatic who's armed with a weapon the exact location of your friend Marcus, it's probably not going to be good, right? And at the same time, if you try to distract the raving lunatic with the gun, the inquiring murderer, with a lie, you try to take them off somewhere else that buys you time to get the authorities involved. You don't know what's going to happen for sure. Sure, you're right, Kant, this could go way wrong. Maybe you don't even know where Marcus is. Maybe you do lead the killer to Marcus, maybe, but still, chances are good that your best, the probabilities here are with you. Try to get the murderer away from you, the inquiring murderer away from you, and try as best you can to get the inquiring murderer away from Marcus while you buy time to maybe get the authorities involved. The uncertainty is not the problem here. The problem here is that Kant wants to avoid uncertainty and pretend that there's this absolute clarity where Rachel's would argue that there is none. And so he further charges Kant with a kind of an inconsistency on his own part, which is that Kant is saying that we would somehow be responsible if we lied and that were to contribute to Marcus's death, but that somehow we wouldn't be responsible if we told the truth and that contributed to Marcus's death. Rachel says that, look, we got to be consistent in both cases. Now, in the 20th century, writing before Rachel's did, probably the person, to my mind, who put the most sort of pointed criticism to Kant's theoretical framework of anybody was, again, Elizabeth Anscombe in 1958 in her famous article, Modern Moral Philosophy, published in the journal Philosophy. And I bring her out, for two reasons. One, she's our first our first major female intellectual in the 20th century, which has everything to do with the history of sort of cultural bias and sexism. But secondly, as much as Elizabeth Anscombe was personally very religious, she was able to sort of separate her personal religious convictions, which caused her to protest the honoring of Truman in '56, from the philosophical argument in the modern age after the modern crisis. And I think that exhibits a tremendous amount of intellectual integrity, and I'm sort of using her as an example of intellectual integrity, because even though she has every reason based on her faith to want Kant to be right, she's able to recognize not only the modern crisis, she's also able to recognize that exactly where the problem is for Kant. And as she says that the problem's in the first step of the three-step process. When you identify your maxim, Kant always does this in sort of the most general way possible. He talks about lying in general. He talks about giving charity in general. He talks about suicide in general. Promise making in general, parting your talents away in general. What's going on there, Anscombe points out, is he's refusing to admit that there's ways to reasonably and rationally differentiate between, let's say, lying in this case versus lying in another case. Lying when it makes you a profit but kills people versus lying when it hurts no one and it's an attempt to save people's lives. And in the latter case, what you would build is a more specific maxim. You would deal with lying in particular situations or contexts. And Anscombe, I think, rightly points out, you could rationally universalize such a more situational maxim, whereas you could not rationally universalize the general maxim. And the problem here, right, is that Kant has sort of done some philosophical hand-waving and drawn our attention maybe away from this point. Why not build more specifics into the principles that we consider even with something like the Kantian framework for thinking through our moral dilemmas? And there doesn't really seem to be a good reason for it. There doesn't seem to be a justification for it, other than the fact that Kant's whole project was an attempt to defend absolute moral truth. And he was probably clever enough to know, and this is probably why he went to such lengths in his arguments against the counterexample in that one essay I referenced. Kant was clever enough to know that the moment you begin to admit of exceptions, the idea of the absolute moral duty is done. And the idea of the absolute truth and clarity that we're seeking in ethics is also seriously problematized and jeopardized. And so I wanted to give Anscombe credit for, a very pointed critique of Kant, despite the fact that she has every cause in her faith to want Kant to be right. She still follows where the argument goes. I didn't mention this in my original lecture, perhaps, but I'll finish up with this. Rachel's, in his own writing on this matter, goes on to just say, look, let's not be too quick to dismiss Kant, even though we're being critical of some of the ways that he tried to use his theory of morality to justify absolute moral rules. He seems to fail or lose the argument, as seen through the sort of 2020 lens of history. He loses the argument about the presence or justifiability of absolute moral rules or absolute moral duties. However, as I think Alistair McIntyre, who I believe is still alive, about the age of 91, writes in his very good book, difficult but good book, A Short History of Ethics, and published in 1966, McIntyre writes, look, morality is basically what Kant says it was. I'm paraphrasing, but it's a very strong bit of praise, I think, in the beginning of his chapter on Kant, if not in the beginning, in his chapter on Kant in that History of Ethics that he writes. And, many people feel like Kant really gets at some crucial things about morality, namely, focus on intentions and motivations mattering, focusing on trying to be principled to a certain degree, trying to be consistent in your reasoning. And even Rachel's, right, who I may have said in my last lecture is or was, before his death in 2003 or 4, a utilitarian, right? So, he's against Kant's theoretical framework. On the one hand, he still praises Kant for, explaining and emphasizing how we have to try to find good reasons and justifications for our moral judgments. It's not enough to just say, because I said so, or because my culture says so, or because I like it, or because I just know it to be right. We have to wrestle a little bit more with our moral judgments and morality in general in order to try to find some good justifications or reasons to back our argument. And then, as Rachel's would go on to say in other work, in order to try to find what he calls the truths of reasons, that the moral judgments that are backed by the best arguments. And I'm very sympathetic to that position, even though I criticize that phrase, the truths of reason. Rachel's here is saying, look, Kant got some things right. Just like McIntyre is saying, Kant had a lot of things right about morality. What I've already said is that Rachel's claims that Kant's right. We have to try to find good reasons. He also says that we should try to be consistent in our moral judgments and try to be, as best we can, principled in our attempt to approach morality. With that said, both Rachel's and the point raised by Anscombe is going to leave us with this idea that we are moving towards a more contextualized understanding of moral judgments. To say that another way, that we are going to start to consider moral judgments, particularly in the 20th and 21st century, more often as being grounded in the specific details of a context. With that said, we still need to try to find good reasons there. And let me just go ahead and point something out, as I often do in my ground classes. Here's a nice way to see yet again how Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics was so far ahead of his time. His doctrine of the mean, which was really about choosing virtuously, still it put virtuous choosing into a context, right? It didn't reject objectivity. It didn't reject the attempt to find good reasons to justify our choices, but it still put virtuous choosing into a context. And he called it subjective in that way. I don't like that language, but it is contextual, let's say, in that way. It's about you in a particular situation, and then you need to try to find the good reasons. And I think with these critiques of Kant that I've reviewed here for you in this brief review of my last lecture, you can see that some of modern ethical thinking, particularly 20th century, 21st century ethical thinking, we're going to see more and more a leaning towards, or at least an inclusion of, this aspect of the context, right? That so long ago, 2,400 years ago, Aristotle had already worked into his own theoretical approach. So that wraps up my brief recap of my lecture on Kantian absolutism.